After a successful opening phase for his invasion of Iberia, Napoleon expected the next one to solidify the gains made, securing the stability and security of Spain. Were it so easy? Despite the emperor's confidence, the Spanish situation remained volatile. Within the decorous walls of the Escorial, the royal palace in Madrid, there was a three-way power struggle between Prime Minister Manuel Godoy on one side, King Carlos IV and Queen Maria Luisa on the other, and then the dark horse, the black sheep, Prince Fernando. Though despised at court and by the public, Godoy had the powerful backing of the French and Spanish king and queen, making him the dominant force in Spanish politics. Languid and inveterate, king and queen were content to leave power in Godoy's hands. The status quo ill-suited the prince. It was no secret that Fernando badly wanted to be king. Hate was his motivator. Hate for his father and mother, hate for Godoy too. For Ferdinand's backers, the Fernandinos, motives went deeper. Disaffected army officers, nobles and priests supported Fernando's candidacy as a protest vote against Godoy's surrender of Spanish independence and the degradations imposed by the French. They supposed that Fernando could be the king to rescue Spanish fortunes, or at least a figurehead for national regeneration. So great were the expectations for Fernando, he was dubbed El Deseado, the Desired. As an outsider, Napoleon was perfectly positioned to play literal kingmaker in the intra-Bourbon spat. Nominally, he was in the Godoy-Carlos camp and inclined to let them stay. Both had accepted enthusiastically the Treaty of Fontainebleau and were more than happy to sell out Spanish independence. The partition of Portugal also made them complicit in Napoleon's Iberian project. On the other hand, there was no love lost. None of Godoy's laundry list of intrigues against France had gone unnoticed, and the emperor justifiably despised Godoy on a personal level, suffering him only because he was useful. Carlos, by contrast, was a fellow monarch, and he and Napoleon enjoyed a benign correspondence, though in private Napoleon judged Carlos a decent man but a weak king. Personal misgivings aside, the Spanish Bourbons were useful allies so long as they kept a lid on Spain as Napoleon chipped away at their independence. Fernando was the obvious alternate Spanish candidate. He was venal, vain, indolent, and very stupid, a perfect cipher. Ironically, these were the exact reasons why he attracted so much domestic support. The Fernandinos saw in the prince anything they wished to see. At once, he was a paragon of virtue, a defender of Catholicism and the downtrodden, and the saviour of Spanish national honour, its Gloria. But in truth, Fernando's only defining trait was his loathing for his parents, the king and queen, and for their favourite, Godoy. Fernando wanted to be king simply because it was his birthright. There was no ability backing that claim. Certainly, hopes from the Fernandinos that unlike King Carlos, that Fernando would fight for Spanish independence were baseless. Highlighting this idiocy, rather than using his domestic base of support, Fernando hitched his horse to France and to Napoleon. On October 17, 1807, right in the middle of the final negotiations for Fontainebleau, Fernando penned a secret letter to Napoleon requesting a Bonaparte bride. Binding the Bourbon and Bonaparte by marriage had its advantages and certainly tickled Napoleon's dynastic instincts. Fernando was beloved, so perhaps his reign might tame Spain. Fernando was also very pliable and unlikely to chart his own course separate from France. Even had the prince shown a hint of resolve, a Bonaparte queen installed in Madrid would confirm French predominance. Not known for his subtlety, Godoy's spies caught Fernando red-handed. Copies of his letters were sent to Carlos, who promptly ordered the prince arrested. Fernando was kept in close confinement at a royal residence in Aranjuez, about 30 miles south of Madrid. Reeling, on November 18, 1807, Carlos resubmitted his son's offer. Napoleon accepted on December 10th, but only in the coming weeks realised that Carlos was not set on the match, having only offered it to save face and make it seem like his idea in the first place, not the prince's. Now knee-deep in the drama, Napoleon also faced trouble actually finding a suitable match. There was only one viable Bonaparte candidate, Charlotte Bonaparte, daughter of Lucien and niece to the emperor. There was a catch. Raised in Italy, Charlotte was unused to France or French customs, and her father was not inclined to let his 12-year-old daughter be a pawn in his elder brother's grand schemes. Despite the frailty of this royal match, at least the Treaty of Fontainebleau, Napoleon believed, was sufficient to stabilize Spain politically. He couldn't have been further off the mark. Fear of a British intervention via Galicia, on the northwest of Spain, prompted Carlos to request the war with Portugal be ended. Spanish diplomats pressed Paris to enact the secret clauses of Fontainebleau without delay. Failing to do so, and the Spanish threatened to withdraw. There was a real possibility that this cleavage in the Franco-Spanish alliance might split into a permanent breach if nothing was done. All Napoleon could offer were vague obfuscations about French policy in Portugal. In a letter to King Carlos on January 10, 1808, he asserted, quote, "I have received the letter from your Majesty. I think that the affairs are not sufficiently advanced to publish the convention on which depends the future of Portugal. First, commissioners must be appointed to set the borders and take all measures necessary to assure the safety of the people, which could be compromised by measures hazardous and premature. The French ambassador to Madrid, François Beauharnais, was instructed to do all he could to mend fences, even gifting horses from the imperial stables to Godoy and Carlos. The situation, however, remained tense into the rest of January and February. This was plenty of time for Napoleon to reconsider his Spanish strategy. The harsh treatment of Fernando inspired pity for l'Entafado within French society. The Minister of the Interior, Hugues Bernard Maret, reported to Napoleon on public opinion, quote, "What has just happened in Spain inspires horror and disgust. King Carlos' proclamation seemed stamped with stupidity and depravity, and now the letters from Fernando, begging for mercy in such a wretched manner, complete the whole picture of utter ugliness. The Bourbons are rushing toward ruin, but do not seem to be able to stand much longer." Strategic logic also dictated a change in policy toward the ruling Bourbon. At the nadir of their power, if ever there was a chance to effect regime change, now was the time, with the Spanish army in Portugal and the prospect of the French armies being seen as liberators of a maltreated Fernando. If Napoleon dallied, Carlos might be toppled from within, giving Fernando leave to form his own government without France as his principal backer. Napoleon was not decided on regime change, but did come to see it as an increasingly desirable strategy. If he couldn't rein in Godoy or Carlos, he would resort to military action. To this end, Napoleon ordered the formation of new armies for an invasion of Spain. On February 20th, Napoleon appointed Joachim Murat as Lieutenant d'Espagne, commander of all French forces in Spain. Under Murat's command would be 3 corps. Each bore a diversionary name to allay fear that their purpose was invasion, so for clarity's sake I'm going to refer to them by numbers in the order of their founding, but just know that each officially was a separate army. Organisationally though, each was a reinforced corps d'armée with which we're well familiar. Founded on January 1st was the Corps d'Observation des Côtes de l'Océan, First Corps for us. In command of First Corps was Marshal Jeannot Moncey, transferred from command of the Gendarmerie. First Division was commanded by Général de Division Louis-Félix Meunier. It was organised into 2 reinforced infantry brigades of 8 line and 2 light regiments each. Second Division was led by Jean-Nicolas Gobert. The 2nd Division was also made of 2 heavy infantry brigades of the same composition. 3rd Division was commanded by Antoine Meurleux. Under him, 2 more infantry brigades. The Cavalry Division was commanded by Emmanuel Grouchy. It consisted of a Dragoon Brigade and a Hussar Brigade. Both cavalry brigades had 2 regiments apiece. The Artillery Division consisted of 2 line artillery regiments, 3 horse artillery regiments, 3 battalions of artillery guards, and a small detachment of the Imperial Guard. Second Corps' official designation was as the Corps d'Observation des Pyrénées Orientales. Its commander was Guillaume Philibert Duhem. First Division was commanded by Joseph Chabrin. It consisted of 2 brigades. First Brigade of 3 line infantry regiments, and 2nd Brigade of 4 line infantry regiments. Attached to Chabrin's division was 1 regiment of horse artillery and its guard battalion. 2nd Division was commanded by Teodoro Lecci. Lecce led an all-Italian brigade of 4 line and 1 light infantry regiments, supported by a line artillery battery. Attached to 2nd Corps were 2 cavalry brigades. The Cuirassier Brigade was commanded by Bertrand Bessières, the younger brother of Marshal Bessières. The Light Brigade of Hussards and Chasseurs à Cheval was led by François-Xavier Schwartz. Finally, we have the Reserve Corps, commanded by Maréchal Jean-Baptiste Bessières. The nucleus of the reserve was formed of the Imperial Guard, commanded by Jean-Marie d'Orsens. The Imperial Guard contingent was a vertical slice of all its many regiments, from grenadier and line regiments to marine, ambulance, and artillery detachments. The Reserve Corps' infantry division was commanded by Pierre Merle. Under him were 2 infantry brigades. 1st Brigade consisted of 3 line regiments and 1 line artillery regiment. The 2nd Brigade consisted of 3 légions and 5 reserve infantry battalions. The Corps' cavalry was divided into 2 divisions. 1st Division was commanded by Joseph Lagrange and consisted of reserve battalions of all cavalry types. 2nd Division had 3 brigades commanded by Hippolyte Sabatier, Nicolas Ducot, and Antoine de Salle, respectively. Each were light cavalry brigades with reserve battalions. Attached to the corps were 2 line artillery regiments and artillery guard battalions. In all, Murat had at his disposal 80,000 troops. When combined with Dupont and Junot's corps, the overall number was closer to 120,000. Here's the catch. Many of the regiments that composed these divisions were not the crack, hardened veterans of Italian, German, and Polish campaigns. They were, with some exceptions, second-rate troops formed from the class of 1806 to 1808. Napoleon's demands on the training and provisioning of new regiments had proven too much. Several units were, as we've seen in the table of organisation, not regular regiments, but either provisional regiments or reserve battalions, in French, bataillon de marche. Spanish service was the first employment of these sorts of second-rate troops. In theory, they were entirely there to sustain irregular units for casualty replacement. In practice, as we'll see, they were deployed for action as regular regiments. Another notable feature of the new French corps was the inclusion of large numbers of non-French divisions and regiments. Lecce's division was all Italian, consisting of Savoyards, Piemontese, Lombards, Ligurians, and Neapolitans. Polish cavalry and infantry regiments would play famous roles in several actions. Several infantry regiments were Swiss, and even Portuguese and Spanish troops fought in these corps, organized into the Légion d'Espagne and the Légion Portugaise. Murat's orders for the invasion of Iberia called for him to envelop northern Spain in a west-east pincer attack launched from either side of the Pyrenees. Operations began on February 16th in the west. Over the next few days, Moncey's 1st Corps advanced from Bayonne onto Pamplona. Advanced units went ahead to Burgos to establish a forward edge beyond the river Ebro. By February 24th, scouts and engineering officers were in contact with Dupont's corps at Valladolid, connecting the 2 strung-out corps. In the eastern Pyrenees, Duhame's 2nd Corps advanced to Barcelona out of Perpignan. Progress was excellent. The Spanish offered no resistance at Godoy's insistence. Supply worries were quashed by thorough preparations. Pierre Darroux of the Ministry of War Administration had sent hundreds of thousands of pain de munitions, basically ration biscuits, to depots at Bayonne, from where they would be dispersed to forward depots at Burgos as the corps advanced. Napoleon also insisted that every soldier passing through Bayonne be given a pair of fresh boots. However, he was wary that the supply lines leading back past the Pyrenees were vulnerable. On February 20th, he chided Murat for failing to take critical city fortresses. Quote, "You will see from enclosed correspondence that General d'Armagnac has failed to occupy the fortress of Pamplona. After amassing artillery, you will write to the Commandant of Navarra in order to secure the rear of the armies, and that I am at peace with the King of Spain. Your communications with the Spanish commanders must be amiable, and you must give your explanations for the occupations of the fortresses as being the need to protect the rear. If the Commandant of Navarra refuses to surrender the fortress, employ Marshal Moncey's troops to force him to do so. Several days after this letter was received, Pamplona still stood defiant. In response, Moncey resorted to a ruse de guerre. He ordered a working party of his soldiers to deliver bread to the garrison. The Spanish were used to this as they were resupplied from French stores. They even joked with the French as they made their delivery, pelting them with snowballs. When the French working party retired, however, they stood on the drawbridge that led into the fort, locking it down. Before the Spanish knew it, a column of fur-shackled grenadiers charged into the fort, forcing its surrender. Grenadiers bumped off Fort San Sebastian as well. Covered by blankets, the grenadiers were borne into the fort on litters and stretchers, claiming to be wounded and in need of shelter. Once inside, they flung aside the blankets and disarmed the Spanish defenders. 2 large garrisons were installed in the mighty fortresses that protected the vital links to Bayonne. The Pamplona garrison, under Général de Brigade d'Ajut, boasted 3 full-line regiments and 1 line artillery battery. At San Sebastian, Général de Brigade Touvenot commanded 2 full-strength legions, several provisional battalions, and an artillery battery. By March 2nd, Marat had met his headquarters at Vitoria and signalled that the north was secure. Rumbling down the road from Bayonne came the Imperial Guard under Bessières. Combined with Dupont's occupation of Valladolid, the French controlled a corridor leading into the heartland province of Castile and the capital in Madrid. The French invasion was a nightmare scenario for Carlos. Throughout most of February, he'd been trying to assure Napoleon of Spain's friendship. His final gamble was to offer Fernando to Charlotte, for real this time. The belated offer fell on deaf ears. Godoy likewise was floundering. At first he'd ordered the garrisons not to resist the French, but after most were disarmed or interred, it became clear that this was not a mere show of force, so he ordered the Spanish army out of Portugal on February 20th, unilaterally ending the Franco-Spanish alliance. Enraged, Napoleon denounced Godoy and Carlos in a memorandum issued on February 24th. Under the circumstances, he no longer felt bound by the Treaty of Fontainebleau. Godoy and Carlos scrambled to salvage the relationship, but Napoleon offered only one narrow hope. Spain would get Portugal intact, but submit to a French occupation of the north of the country, roughly along the line of the River Ebro. Carlos and Godoy received the ultimatum in horror. If they were unpopular now, how could they possibly survive greenlighting the kingdom's humiliation? Delay and obfuscation impossible, both hoped to flee their posts and escape to the Americas. But unlike the Braganzas, there was no Royal Navy frigate in port there to whisk them away. Besides, Spanish America was already in uproar. Sticking and holding was also impossible. The Bourbon court had, by now, retired to Aranjuez in hope that if war came, they wouldn't be vulnerable in Madrid. Hopes were dashed, however, as the neglected Spanish army refused to answer the call. The Royal Guard too refused to fight. Seeing no alternative, the king relented, accepting the French ultimatum as Godoy belatedly ordered all garrisons in occupied parts of the country to comply with French orders. Nothing and no one stood guard to protect Madrid. The writing was on the wall for the Spanish Bourbons. Carlos, Maria Luisa and Godoy were offered assurances of their safety by Ambassador Beauharnais if they returned from Aranjuez to Madrid and surrendered peacefully. On March 3rd, Murat's divisions were ordered to march. Dupont on Toledo to cut escape routes to Seville, and Moncey to seize Madrid itself. With that, the King, Queen and Prime Minister sat inert, awaiting the inevitable. It didn't take long for Prince Fernando to see his opportunity in the power void. Never hands-on, he let it be known that he would assume the throne if it should be offered. This was good enough for the Fernandinos, who over the next 2 weeks agitated and organised on the prince's behalf. Demonstrations paraded through the streets. Spokespeople invade peasants and soldiers against the absentee monarchs. Royal guardsmen defected in droves. Fearing for their lives, the royal family and Godoy stayed holed up in Aranjuez, despite renewed French demands they present themselves in Madrid. Even as the first French scouts reached Aranjuez, there were too few to offer any real protection. Aranjuez exploded into violence on March 17th. The previous day, rumours had spread that the royal family was set to flee. Guardsmen loyal to Fernando were bashed by those of Carlos when they tried to get answers. Retaliating, the pro-Fernando mobs and soldiers attacked the home of Godoy. He narrowly avoided capture at home by stuffing himself into a rolled-up carpet in his attic, where he hid until the 19th. Furious that the Prime Minister eluded them, the mob vented their rage on other loyalists, as well as the friends and family of Godoy. Civic buildings were gutted by fire, homes looted, and officials, including the Minister of Finance, lynched. After the mob pummeled through the gates of Aranjuez Palace, King Carlos capitulated, firing Godoy. 2 days later, on March 19th, he abdicated when the last of the royal guard and army officers defected. Carlos and Maria Luisa were at least physically inviolate. Godoy was not so fortunate. After 30 hours, he could endure no more and stumbled out into the street, dehydrated and dishevelled. In the clutches of the mob, he was beaten savagely, losing an eye. Stripped naked, he was shackled to a cart and exposed to the sun. Guaranteed, Godoy would have withered and died were it not for a French patrol that chanced upon the scene. Rescued, Godoy was deposited, along with Carlos and Maria Luisa, in El Escorial in Madrid. By March 23rd, Moral's units had arrived in force. In a quick appraisal of the situation, he joined Bayonne and refused to recognise Fernando as king. A letter reached Moral soon thereafter instructing him to protect the royal family and the now ex-Prime Minister. By the end of the Tumult of Aranjuez, as the episode was called, Fernando was hailed as king. He entered Madrid to a hero's welcome on the 24th, every bit the Spanish favourite. Carlos, now flanked by French sabres, felt emboldened to protest his rough handling. Not unduly, he claimed he was forced to abdicate under duress, nullifying the procedure. He went to the French seeking support for reinstatement. Fernando, seeking French assent to his enthronement, claimed that he was king by popular demand and by force of arms. With both sides resorting to French mediation, the true victor of the Tumult of Aranjuez would be Napoleon. He was pleasantly surprised by the news as Murat conveyed it on March 26th. This was the perfect opportunity for Napoleon to enter the fray not as a conqueror, but as a mediator, sought by both sides, retroactively justifying his occupations. So it was that all sides agreed to meet. Napoleon was, at that time, in Paris, but he had every intention of going to Madrid, even instructing Murat to prepare suitable lodgings in the Prado or El Escorial. Advanced parties of the royal household were already in Burgos. However, diplomatic entanglements with Russia and Austria could not wait, delaying departure from Saint-Cloud until April 2nd. After passing through Tours, Poitiers, and Angoulême, and then finally Bordeaux, the emperor arrived in Bayonne on April 15th, much later than he'd have liked. Quote, "I arrived here in good health, a little tired from the road, which is dreary and very bad," wrote Emperor to Empress. "I'm glad you stayed, because the houses here are quite poor and very small. Today I'm going to a small house in the countryside where I will stay half a league from the city." On the way to Bayonne, Napoleon had heard that intermediaries of Carlos and Fernando had tried to intercept him in Paris. He also learned from Murat that Fernando, rather than wait around, was heading north. Carlos and Maria Luisa were not far behind, having departed on the 14th. We arrive now, just as Napoleon did, in April of 1808, at something of a quandary. What was he to do with Spain? Later histories have painted the picture of a sinister plot, months, if not years in the offing, of Napoleon's scheme to supplant the Bourbons in Spain and expand the dynastic demesnes of the Bonapartes. These claims are unsubstantiated. Until the fracturing of the Spanish Bourbons, Napoleon's Spanish strategy had been aimed at keeping Spain within the French orbit as an effective ally. You don't invade and overthrow the government of an ally on a whim. So why then do you invade your ally? The imminent change in Napoleon's policy is explicable as an attempt to arrest Spain's slip out of alignment, and to re-establish the foundations of its relationship to France as a client state, in line with all the other client states of the broader Grand Empire. This then prompts the commensurate question, why was it so important not to let Spain lapse in its commitments to France? Certainly geography is a factor, though not as significant as might be thought. While a potentially hostile Spain on its southern border would be less than ideal, Historically, the Pyrenees proved a peerless natural boundary and eminently defensible border. So keeping Spain in the continental system must be the reason. Certainly this was a not insignificant part of Napoleon's rationale, but the excuse to intervene in the domestic affairs of foreign states provided by the system was far more useful in the case of neutral or hostile nations, not ones ostensibly already allied and part of that system. In actuality, the fundamental reason why Napoleon intervened and invaded Iberia was due to wider strategic ambitions. Buckle up, because we're going on one hell of a tangent that'll take us, weirdly, not to Madrid, not to London, not even back to the continental system, but to Sicily. Napoleon had never given up his ambitions for a French return to the Mediterranean. The prize was to be Sicily in the short term, Sardinia, Malta, Egypt and Greece later on. Conquering Sicily would be a naval operation, and Minister of the Navy, Denis Descrest, was provided with ample funding and resources to restore French naval might. With the integration of Italian and Dutch shipyards, dozens of new warships took to the seas. Most formidable were the large ships of the line named after recent battles: l'Austerlitz, le Marengo, le Breslau, l'Eylau, le Donauwörth and l'Iéna. Most of the new hulls, however, were 20 to 40 gun frigates, ideally suited to green water fighting demanded by a frenetic littoral campaign. Napoleon did all he could to furnish Contre-Amiral Honoré Ganteaume, commander of Mediterranean forces, with new vessels and alternate sources of vessels. Indeed, we've already seen this plan in action. A major part of Napoleon's logic behind the alliance with Denmark and the invasion of Portugal was to secure their fleets for use off the Sicilian coast. From 1806 to 1808, the French rebuilt their naval strength. Napoleon was on Descrest's arse the entire time. A very typical letter from January 6, 1807 read, quote, "Therefore you must try and sail le Vétéran to Lorient. It is a favourable season. Have the frigates pass through to Cherbourg, which are at Le Havre. Have La Comète leave the port of Passage to join one of our ports. Quickly arm the frigate of Le Fleur, since the Rochefort squadron is without frigates. Also, put in harbour Le Jemappe and Le Genois. Prepare everything to put in harbour before May 1st Le Commerce de Lyon, Le Charlemagne, l'Anversois, Le Duguay-Tourin, Le César, and Le Tessé, so that these 6 ships, along with Le Royal Hollandois, can form a squadron of 7 ships at Flushing." Transfers and redeployments of French ships throughout the period were extensive. Of course, Napoleon wanted much of this strength for Ganteaume's Toulon squadron. Mediterranean facilities and ships were part of this pledge. Refurbished shipyards in Genoa and Venice rose to the occasion. La Spezia and Ancona sheltered squadrons, and Neapolitan ports were dredged to allow for the transit of deep-hulled 80-gunners. The Royal Navy did what it could to hinder the French, raiding and harassing all along the Italian and Adriatic coastlines. Corfu was blockaded, stranding the French garrison that had occupied the island after the Treaty of Tilsit. Distressingly, the British enjoyed support from local Greeks, Italians and Croats on the Adriatic coast. Still, the Royal Navy presence overall was light, and the French soon had the numerical and qualitative edge. Napoleon proposed a large show of force to Descrest in September 1807, stating that, quote, "the time is ripe for an expedition." Ganteaume amassed the French Mediterranean fleet at Toulon. They launched in February 1808. Ganteaume scattered the Royal Navy at the helm of his flagship, La Tactique. He resupplied and reinforced Corfu, left some frigates as ordered, and made haste for Taranto. Lasting damage to the British was minimal, but proved at least in concept that a landing on Sicily was possible, even if Descrest and Ganteaume weren't overly keen on the idea. They were even less keen as Napoleon took the success of the limited Corfu expedition to mean that expeditions to Egypt, Algeria and Tunis could be contemplated. Plans were hatched, all of which required Spanish assistance to prove feasible. Napoleon also turned to Spain for support for a proposed French return to the Americas, an expedition that would make forays into the Mediterranean look like a hop and a skip by comparison. While ships were built for or transferred to the Med, Napoleon engaged Descrest to reinforce squadrons at Brest, Lorient and Flushing for the American expedition. The Spanish were to contribute their fleet out of Cadiz. They were decently keen on the idea of a joint Franco-Spanish expedition, as it might be able to restore order in the American colonies. However, the Spanish fleet was, after Trafalgar, depleted to 15 ships of the line, and horrifically underfunded. Godoy had at one point simply stopped paying for the upkeep of the navy. Napoleon supported the Spanish aim to pacify their wayward colonies, at least in principle, because it would further his own ends to return France to the Americas. He insisted they contribute 6 ships to the proposed invasion of Sicily and make the rest ready for the Americas. On April 28, 1808, Napoleon assessed his naval assets. Quote, "If we have 19 ships in the Mediterranean, 3 in the Adriatic at Ancona, 20 at Flushing, 25 at Brest, Lorient and Rochefort, 2 at Bordeaux, 8 at Cadiz and Lisbon, we have 77 French ships. To this we add the 10 of Holland, 1 of Denmark, 12 of the Russians in the Baltic, 11 which the Russians have in the Mediterranean, 20 of the Spaniards, totaling 54. This would form a mass of 131 ships of the line, backed by camps of troops at Texel, Antwerp, Boulogne, Brest, Lorient, Rochefort, Reggio and Taranto, of the Spaniards at Ferrol and Cartagena, of Girona and Lisbon. This looks to me like a chessboard on which, without asking too much of fortune, we should expect very good results." Promising though Napoleon's plan appeared, at least to him, they rested on Spanish assent and contributions. So no surprise then that Spanish instability capsized these plans. The Treaty of Fontainebleau, the Tumult of Aranjuez, and the looming Capitulations of Bayonne all undermined the last vestiges of Spanish authority in the Americas. Accounting for the approximate 3-month delay of transatlantic news to percolate to the far-flung corners of South America, in September 1808, all hell broke loose as the various Spanish-American viceroyalties declared themselves independent republics, first Mexico, then Gran Colombia, later joined by the Rio de la Plata. On the one hand, this was a disaster, on the other, an opportunity. Napoleon sent ships to receive reports from the French governor of Guyana, Victor Hugues, and the governor of Guadeloupe, Jean-Augustin Herneuf. Both confirmed the reports of Decrè's agents that the Spanish-American Empire was aflame. Napoleon took advantage of the chaos, sending Capitaine Aimable Trude and his Lorient-based squadron of Le Courageux, Le Polonais, and Dotpol to reinforce Guadeloupe and to intercept Brazilian, British, Swedish, and even American shipping. No matter what Trude might achieve, it paled in comparison to the riches and resources Napoleon believed Spain should have been able to procure. But between corruption, mismanagement, and discord, Spain was ever the disappointment. Their many failures as an ally ultimately stemmed from instability, and so Napoleon's plans in the Med and in the Americas ran into the inevitable question of what to do with Spain. The final decision, to replace the Bourbons, was not one made lightly. Napoleon had invested in Godoy long after he'd proven to be an opportunist. He'd supported the Bourbons to the hilt. But by April 1808, there was no light at the end of this tunnel, only expectation of more chaos and calamity out of Madrid. This final decision to oust the Spanish Bourbons was born of the failure of Napoleon's strategy to rehabilitate Spain under its own leaders. Since Spain was such a linchpin in Napoleon's far larger and far grander strategy, he about-faced, determining that a French eagle must be called upon to tame the Spanish lion. If the Spanish Bourbons were to go, so too was Manuel Godoy. That said, he could not be maltreated and simply thrown to the wayside. Godoy arrived in Bayonne on April 24th and allowed to convalesce. In a letter to Talleyrand, Napoleon confided, quote, "This unfortunate man is pitiable. He spent a month between life and death. Would you say that in that time he didn't change his shirt and that he had a 7-inch beard? The Spanish nation has shown unparalleled inhumanity. The most absurd things are said about him. They say he has 500 million, and yet just yesterday the ringleaders were saying, 'What has he done with his money? We've only found running water from a large house.' Have articles written not to justify the Prince of the Peace, but to vividly depict the misfortune of these popular events, and draw pity upon this unfortunate man." A few days on, Godoy was in Paris. He would never govern again, never hold the great titles he coveted, but he did get to live out the rest of his days in comfortable enough exile in France and later Italy. Prince Fernando was also to be exiled. Some of the complexities of Napoleon's opinions are revealed in a letter to Fernando, written on April 16th, where he admonishes the prince for the Tumult of Aranjuez. Quote, "Mon frère, I have received your Royal Highness' letter. You must have found proof in the papers you received from your father the king of the interest I have always shown you. It will allow me, in the present circumstances, to speak to you frankly and honestly. Upon arriving in Madrid, I hoped to persuade my illustrious friend the king to implement some necessary reforms in his states and to appease public opinion. The dismissal of the Prince of the Peace seemed necessary to me for his happiness and that of his subjects. The affairs of the north delayed my journey. The events at Aranjuez took place. I am not a judge of what happened or of the Prince of the Peace's conduct, but what I do know is that it is dangerous for kings to accustom their people to bloodshed and to taking justice into their own hands. I pray to God that your Royal Highness will not one day experience this firsthand." Even before Fernando reached Bayonne, he was denied the crown. Quote, "I say to your Royal Highness, to the Spanish people, to the whole world, if King Carlos' abdication was purely voluntary, if he was not forced into it by the insurrection and uprising at Aranjuez, I have no difficulty accepting it, and I would recognize your Royal Highness as King of Spain. However, your Majesty is at fault." As consolation, Napoleon confirmed that the royal match with Charlotte was still on, but to, quote, "turn a weak ear to advisers who demanded he seize the throne or punish Godoy, lest Spain be plunged into civil war." On April 29th, Napoleon informed Carlos of his stance. Quote, "I have received all of your Majesty's letters. I have not recognized and will never recognize the Prince of Asturias as King of Spain. I have made this officially clear to him. Queen Maria Louisa received similar guarantees, not for her throne, but the life of Godoy." So it was that the Spanish parties arrived in Bayonne in early May. They were there to accept Napoleon's dictates. The king and queen would return to being the king and queen, but for Fernando, reality hadn't quite hit. Napoleon called it a, quote, "cold reception" between parents and child. Though pleasant enough in person, Napoleon was disgusted by Fernando. He told Talleyrand, quote, "The King of Prussia is a hero compared to the Prince of Asturias. He hasn't said a word to me yet. He's indifferent to everything, very materialistic, eats 4 times a day, and has no idea about anything." When it finally dawned on Fernando that he was to be denied the crown, he chucked a tantrum. Napoleon spilled the tea to Talleyrand. Quote, "The Prince of Asturias is very stupid, very wicked, and a great enemy of France. You can well imagine that given my experience in dealing with men, his 24 years of experience could not sway me, and this is so obvious to me that it would take a long war to make me recognize him as King of Spain. I also informed him that since King Carlos was in my care, I was to have no further dealings with the prince. Consequently, I had his messengers arrested, and letters of bitterness and hatred against the French were found on them, whom he repeatedly calls those damned French." An ultimatum was soon among the prince's papers, a demand to abdicate and recognize Carlos by midnight on May 5th, or be branded a rebel. Fernando gave in, returning the crown to his father. The next day, in a perfunctory ceremony, Carlos was crowned king for a second time. He reigned for 2 days before, as per the deal with Napoleon, he signed a pre-written abdication. To remove the threat of Bourbon resurgence, the royal family was exiled. A gout-ridden Carlos, joined by Maria Louisa, resided at Compiègne for a few years before retiring to exile in Italy. Both died within days of each other in 1819. Their black sheep of a son was hosted by Talleyrand at his estate in Valencia. All were to be paid a stipend from the French treasury, but in practice they relied upon their own fortunes, still vast enough for a lavish lifestyle despite the loss of Spain. Prince Fernando, for instance, refurbished Valencia at his own expense, much to Talleyrand's delight. It was a quiet exile. Fernando quickly took to cutting out patterns in paper. But for reasons beyond imagining, he fancied himself as something of an expert on Spain, deluding himself that his proximity to Napoleon might, eventually, persuade the emperor to grant him the crown. So ingrained was Fernando's Valencia syndrome that he would go on to congratulate Napoleon for his victories in Spain and refuse rescue from loyal Fernandinos. So with the Spanish throne vacant, the question now was who was to be king of Spain. Obviously Napoleon wanted a Bonaparte, one of his brothers. Lucien was the obvious choice. He was uninvested and dwelling comfortably in Rome. Perhaps the offer of a throne might coax him out of exile. On the other hand, Napoleon and Lucien had a massive falling out over Christine Boyer, Lucien's wife, with whom he eloped in 1794. Christine died in 1800, and Lucien had never forgiven his brother for the way he'd treated her. All that was left of Christine was young Charlotte, whom Napoleon was, as we know, bandying about in his Iberian intrigues. Napoleon wrote to Lucien making the offer, but received no reply. Neither he nor his daughter would play pawns in dynastic intrigues. Napoleon was, at first, furious, then resentful, and finally resigned. Lucien would not budge. Not even a crown could change that. Lucien a bust, Napoleon considered Jérôme, king of Westphalia since July 1807. Unique among the Bonaparte brothers, Jérôme actually liked his job. He reclined supine in the satin lap of luxury, his ego tickled, pride satiated. Jérôme's marriage to Catherine of Württemberg was a happy sham. Both had numerous affairs. That all being so, Jérôme did have a serious side, and it would be deeply unfair to simply call him a bungler or an idler. In his mind, he wanted to, quote, revolutionize Westphalia into a model kingdom for the rest of Germany to emulate. The problem was, Napoleon expected him to be a Bonaparte prince first, king of Westphalia second. Quote, my orders must come first, Napoleon said in January 1808. You will not be in possession of your kingdom until the disputes of interest that France has with your provinces are settled. Actual control of the kingdom was to be exercised by the Franco-German Commission, headed by Minister Premier Joseph Simeon. Of the dozen commissioners, Jérôme was allowed to handpick only one. All major decisions in Westphalia were therefore made by Napoleon, indirectly. He even sent a full constitution, draft legal and civil codes, and a full French-style army table of organization for Jérôme to merely green light and his ministers to enact. Jérôme chafed. If he couldn't do the big things, he conspired to nab control where he could, making speeches, issuing decrees, and promoting favourites who Napoleon considered, quote, fit only for the gallows. Invariably, Napoleon shot him down. Oftentimes there was a good cause, as Jérôme was a bit of a tit. In one speech, he invoked the glory of Austerlitz, earning a stifling rebuke from Napoleon. Quote, why speak of Austerlitz? Is it to break the heart of a sovereign and a nation that I have an interest in sparing today? This was not the proclamation of a sovereign, but the speech of a publicist. Westphalia was chronically short on funds, most of which Napoleon wanted channeled into paying France's 12,500-strong garrison and expanding the Westphalian army. Instead, Jérôme proposed to overhaul the administration, which earned him a flurry of denunciation. Quote, as for the 60,000 francs you are giving your ministers, it is madness. They should not have more than 20,000. My ministers in Italy receive 30,000 francs. You are placing your country on a footing of luxury that will cause its decline. In a fit of pique, Jérôme tried to wrestle some control in December 1807 with the demand for an oath of allegiance from his councillors and ministers, a vast majority of whom were French and therefore Napoleon's subjects. Quote, I received your letter concerning the speech you delivered to your Council of State. I found this speech ridiculous. No Frenchman will swear the oath you demand, except for those whom I would grant permission to enter your service. My councillors of state, nor even my officers, can swear this oath to you. If Bougenot and Simeon wish to remain with you, they are free to do as they please. If they have taken the oath you demanded, I will strike them from the list of my councillors of state. Being charitable, Napoleon wanted Westphalia well run so it could be an asset, not a liability. He viewed his letters to Westphalia as lessons, less so than instructions. But sometimes he realized the tone was abhorrent. Quote, my friend, I love you, but you are furiously young, read a postscriptum in March 1808. Napoleon gave Jérôme latitude on certain select matters only when he felt the fundamentals were in place. For instance, don't fund a large dynamic foreign ministry when your only concern is German neighbours, which was a recurring bone of contention. Intentions are one thing, perception another, and the impression Jérôme got from Napoleon's lessons was not of brotherly compassion, but patriarchal dominion. For these and all other reasons, Jérôme was not a fit candidate for Spain. Someone with a proven track record might fare better. The obvious pick was Louis, King of Holland. Of all the Bonaparte brothers, Louis fared best as king, proving to be a capable administrator, inventive reformer, and popular figurehead. With all the multivalent woes facing Holland, Louis had navigated choppy seas admirably. From Saint-Cloud on March 27th, Napoleon wrote to his brother, informing him of the Capitulations of Bayonne and formally offering him the crown of Spain. Quote, "Mon frère, the King of Spain has just abdicated. Certain that I will only have a lasting peace with England, by changes on the continent, I have resolved to place a French prince on the throne of Spain. The climate of Holland is not to your liking. Besides, Holland cannot rise from its ruins. In this maelstrom of the world, whether peace is achieved or not, there is no way for it to be sustained. In this situation, I am considering you for the throne of Spain. You will be sovereign of a generous nation, of 11 million people, and of important colonies. Spain can have 60,000 men under arms and 50 ships in port. If I name you King of Spain, will you accept it? Can I count on you?" The pitch rang hollow for Louis. In truth, he did feel at home in Holland. His family, Queen Hortense in particular, had suffered great tragedy when their young son Charles died at 5 years old. Louis, the surviving eldest son, needed his father. Besides, Hortense was heavily pregnant and couldn't travel. She would give birth to a healthy boy on April 20th, 1808, only a few weeks after Napoleon's Spanish offer. He requested the boy be named Charles in honour of his dead brother. Christened Louis Charles, history had much in store for him. The last possible Bonaparte candidate for the vacant Spanish crown was Joseph, King of Naples. Joseph had already made the transition from one crown to another, vacating the Grand Duchy of Cleves-Berg to Murat for the Kingdom of Naples in March 1806. Since then, Joseph had ruled a kingdom that was still very much at the centre of Napoleon's Mediterranean ambitions, but who proved, like all the Bonaparte brothers, to be less than hoped for by Napoleon, whether fairly or not. Acute consternation was caused by Joseph's rejection of a delegation of Neapolitan cardinals. Napoleon ordered to be taken from Rome and sent to swear an oath of loyalty to Joseph. Against orders, Joseph sent them packing, rightly worried it would incense his Catholic subjects. Quote, "What on earth are you afraid of with these 2 or 3 old priests?" responded Napoleon. "I am not accustomed to seeing such weakness and ineptitude where I am in command." He took this as a sign of weakness, that Joseph was insecure on the throne, and he wasn't wrong. Joseph was struggling with the daunting task of subduing and ruling a kingdom without a popular base of support, and constrained by the need to divert resources to a foreign backer. The offer of the Spanish crown, then, appeared like a golden lifeline. On May 10th, 1808, Napoleon formally offered Joseph the Kingdom of Spain. King Carlos, by the Treaty of Bayonne, cedes to me all his rights to the crown of Spain. The Prince of Asturias had previously renounced his supposed title of king, because King Carlos had alleged that his abdication had been forced. Spain, through the Supreme Council of Castile, is asking me for a king. It is to you that I dedicate this crown. Spain is not like the Kingdom of Naples. It has 11 million inhabitants, more than 150 million in revenue, not to mention its immense wealth and possession of all the Americas. Moreover, it is a crown that places you in Madrid, 3 days from France, and that completely covers one of its borders. In Madrid, you are in France. Naples is at the end of the world. I therefore wish that immediately upon receiving this letter, you leave the regency to whomever you wish, the command of the troops to Marshal Jourdan, and that you depart for Bayonne by way of Turin, Mont-Cenis, and Lyon. Keep the rest a secret. It will perhaps be all too obvious, but you will say that you are going to northern Italy to confer with me on important matters. Without reservation, Joseph accepted the crown, agreeing for the second time to transplant himself, his wife, Queen Julie, and their two daughters, Zenaide and Charlotte, to a new life in Spain. Joseph wouldn't arrive until July, more than enough time for Napoleon to complete his subjugation of the Iberian Peninsula. The task, he believed, was as good as done. To Talleyrand he confided, quote, "If this thing were to cost me 80,000 men, I wouldn't do it, but it won't take me more than 12,000. It's mere child's play. I don't want to hurt anybody, but when my great political chariot is rolling, it's as well to stand from under the wheels. Unless I am mistaken, this tragedy is in Act 5. The denouement will soon play out." Spain was a tragedy all right, though not one close to curtain call. Tensions in Spain had been on a simmer since the Tumult of Aranjuez. The forces of popular revolt had since then only been kept in check by the bayonets of Murat's corps. While Napoleon was double-crossing the Spanish Bourbons, Murat kept Madrid in check as the man on the ground, the Lieutenant d'Espagne. He was anxious. In March, he reported that the mood in Madrid, and Spain more generally, had rapidly turned anti-French. The font of this discontent was the endless wellspring of popular resentment against a foreign occupier, fueled by food shortages as French troops requisitioned and pilfered. Priests stoked these flames with their own invectives. It wasn't hard to convince the Catholic population of Spain that the French would break the traditional power of the Church, as they had in their own lands, and enact atheistic policy. Organised anti-French action originated with the Fernandinos, who railed against the shabby treatment of El Deseado, the desired King Fernando. Of this looming threat, Murat was aware, but dangerously out of his depth. Give him an open field and an enemy to charge down, and there was no one braver. But to occupy a city and pacify a population, this was a different role that required a tactful, steady hand. Without the threat of the Spanish army resisting, most of Murat's officers were blasé about the occupation. They retired to mansions and apartments in central Madrid, while the army resided in camps outside the city limits. Only a few buildings and checkpoints were guarded. Napoleon was aghast to learn that the city arsenal was not occupied, and that the city gates were largely unguarded. An uprising on April 1st was a wake-up call for Murat. He was fortunate in that it lacked for proper organisation or support. Emmanuel Grouchy's dragoons restored order at the cost of several French soldiers killed. Spooked, Murat tried to calm the situation, issuing a decree that Napoleon would appear in Madrid in a few weeks, and that the French would withdraw from some public plazas. Though Murat had wide latitude as Lieutenant d'Espagne, switching up the imperial itinerary was too much. Napoleon rebuked Murat, stating, quote, "I see that you attach too much importance to the opinion of the city of Madrid. I did not assemble such large armies in Spain to indulge the whims of the Madrid populace." Napoleon's message was crystal clear, but Murat continued to disappoint. After an incident in Burgos, Murat issued a proclamation commending the bravery of the men involved. Ill-judged in Napoleon's imperial opinion. Quote, "It is time to show energy. I assume you will not spare the Madrid mob if it budges. A man at the head of 50,000 soldiers should not write such a letter as you wrote, nor have recourse to intriguing methods. Your order on the day of the Burgos affair is wretched. Good God! Where would I be if I were given to writing 4 pages to tell the soldiers not to be disarmed, and to extol as a heroic deed the fact that a detachment of 15 men fired on a mob? Frenchmen are too acute not to laugh at such proclamations, and mine is not the school at which you learned to write them. What will you do in a crisis if you lavish your proclamations now? 3 orders of the day like yours would demoralize an army." Napoleon advised, instead, stronger precautions than mere proclamations. If Murat was to stabilize the situation, he should focus not on the populace, but on Spain's influential and powerful, by mollifying the clergy and nobility with offers of protection for loyalty, a winning formula that had been proven successful in pacifying Italy. Any who refused French beneficence were to be arrested. For good measure, Madrid was also to be properly occupied. Few of the Spanish nobles or clergy made the devil's bargain. Arrest orders followed. The population of Madrid rallied to the defence of the nobles, physically blocking passage to their homes. On May 2nd, tensions boiled over. The inciting incident was the attempted arrest of Francis de Paula, Carlos' youngest son. Just outside his home, on the Puerta del Sol, the mob flooded over, spilling out into the city. French garrisons at key positions were bowled over in a wave of anger. About 150 were killed, either dying at their posts or lynched after capture. Marat's headquarters at the royal palace was surrounded. Escorted by dragoons, Captain Mercenaire Marbeau was sent to summon the army from their camps around Madrid. They had already been alerted by the crash-bang of heavy fighting. The Mamelukes of the Guard deployed to clear the Puerta del Sol, breaking up the mob with churning, bloody charges. Mixed units of chasseurs and dragoons then drove the remainder out into Madrid's outer districts, the dragoons prowling at street level, the chasseurs firing from the rooftops. Marat immediately placed Madrid under martial law. As military governor, Grouchy was empowered to detain and then execute any man found outside his home, or who was in any way suspected of involvement in the uprising. Violence was retributive and indiscriminate. It was good enough for a man to have dirt on his hands, taken for powder burns, to be deemed an insurgent. Over the next 4 days, about 400 would be executed, with about half as many killed in the uprising. Napoleon learned of the uprising on May 5th, smack bang in the middle of negotiating the Abdications of Bayonne. He dismissed it as one and done. Quote, "An insurrection broke out in Madrid on the 2nd. 30 or 40,000 people collected in the streets and in the houses, firing from windows. 2 battalions of the Fusiliers of the Guard, with 400 or 500 cavalry, restored order. More than 2,000 of the mob were killed." Indeed, Napoleon's reaction was sublimely dismissive. Further reports from across Spain, of arms being stockpiled, of popular uprisings, of Spaniards rallying, failed to deter Napoleon's conviction that Spain would be a pushover. It would be enough to place Joseph on the throne to pacify Spain, and then institute a program of reform to stabilize the kingdom. Joseph and his family had, by mid-June, convened in Bayonne, ready to make their trip to Spain. The stage had been set for the purported final act. Napoleon collected dozens of pro-French Spanish grandees to head an interim government. They were required to ratify Joseph's accession and to sign off on a Spanish constitution, the first in the country's history. Down in Madrid, Marat had wrangled a rump of the Council of Castile and the Council of the Indies to formally invite Joseph to assume the throne. It was vital that Joseph strike the right tone, at once conciliatory and prideful. Quote, "The junta must deliver an address to you tomorrow. Prepare your reply. You must speak of the sorrow you feel at the unrest in Spain, of the necessity of using force to suppress it, and achieve a result that only reason and conviction should have produced, and hint at your desire to soon visit your new subjects to reconcile all interests, and begin your reign with acts of pardon and clemency. It would be good if this speech were somewhat lengthy and carefully crafted. Gabriel Edeville speaks perfect Spanish. You could take him on as your private secretary. He is a perfectly reliable man, whose devotion and integrity you can count on." On July 9th, Napoleon accompanied Joseph on the coach trip to the Spanish border, sending him on his way with a bundle of instructions and letters. The royal procession trundled along at a ponderous pace, receiving little welcome from the Spanish populace. In Madrid, Joseph was crowned as Rey de España, King of Spain. Installed alongside Rey José was the Constitution. It was a lightly modified version of the Constitution of the Kingdom of Naples, and contained all the goodies part and parcel for French constitutions: legal equality, rule of law, and male suffrage. Uniquely, the Spanish Constitution also abolished the Inquisition and enshrined Catholicism as the state religion. The Constitution was configured to endear itself to exactly the kind of middle and upper-class men who, in France, were well served by constitutional government. It was also crafted to incorporate enough of the Spanish national character to make a dose of French constitutionalism palatable. Certainly, this was a winning formula in Italy, in Germany, in Poland, and elsewhere, but would prove ill-suited to Spain, where the roots of Bourbon absolutism and Catholic reaction proved too entrenched. That said, the French did have their backers in Spain, dubbed the Josefinos or the Afrancesados. Mostly, these men were lower nobles or members of the middle class, both groups who stood to gain directly from political enfranchisement. Ideological motivations played their part, as many Spaniards had believed for several years that Spain was backward and underdeveloped. Afrancesados formed a collaboration government in Madrid, staffing its ministries, participating in its Cortes, and generally backing the French. Only a few thousand Spaniards went so meekly. The rising of Madrid was a clarion call for Spain to arm and resist. In late May, collaborationist governors in Badajoz, Cádiz, and Cartagena were assassinated. 38 French merchants in Valencia were also lynched. By early June, most of Spain was in revolt. The basis of these revolts were the regional juntas. Junta is a term usually invoked nowadays in the context of a military junta, with a generalissimo and senior officers taking control of a nation. For our purposes, the word junta has a specific original meaning. Like a Cortes, a junta was a regional government, but one self-appointed in times of crisis. They were a long-standing feature of internal Spanish politics, with juntas declared at various points in its history. There were a couple of juntas during the 80 Years' War against the Dutch, several during periods of Catalan rebellion, and most recently during the War of Spanish Succession. Juntas could side with or against the central government. They were not, it should be noted, solely military affairs. Recent juntas were actually comprised mostly of civilians, with officers swearing fealty in exchange for material support. This pattern went unchanged into June 1808 as the Spanish resistance assumed shape. Support for the juntas emanated from every scion of Spanish society. Peasants and clergy abhorred the repudiation of Catholicism and defaulted to a kind of patriarchal vision of royalism. Nobles sought to preserve, even expand, their own privileges, officers to restore national honour. Middle-class types exhibited the widest possible range of motivations. They were split between a rump, which was uncomplicatedly royalist, and the rest who were liberal, actually broadly inclined towards the French before the outbreak of hostilities. This liberal royalist fissure would, in time, prove disastrous for the juntas, but initially served to unite them, and put paid to the idea that they were solely reactionary affairs. Though the stated goal of the juntas was to reinstall Fernando as king, that was not a prerequisite for joining. Patriotic opposition to the French was. Led by regional grandees and army officers, juntas sprung up all across Spain. For us, we're interested in the three main regional juntas which were declared in June 1808, one in Valencia, one in Leon, and one in Seville. Each laid claim to their given region and subsumed smaller juntas. Valencia claimed Aragon, Catalonia, and Murcia. Leon claimed Castile, Asturias, and Galicia. Seville claimed Andalusia and the capital around Madrid. Each had formed and declared itself in revolt independently, and therefore remained tightly regionally focused. They raised and equipped their own armies to wage war in their own regions. The Junta of Leon called upon two armies. The Army of Galicia was commanded by Lieutenant General Joaquin Blake, comprised of about 10,000 infantry and 500 cavalry, with 20 or so guns of varying calibre. The second army, the Army of Asturias, had about the same number and was commanded by Gregorio Garcia de la Cuesta. A reserve formation, the Army of Castile, consisted of 19 understrength infantry regiments, numbering perhaps 3,000 troopers in total. The Junta of Valencia formed three field armies. The Army of Valencia was led by Felipe Carlos Osorio, Count of Cervellon. It numbered 17,000 troops. The Army of Murcia had less than half that number, probably fewer than 7,000, and was commanded by Pedro González de Lamas. The largest field army was the Army of Aragon, a whopping 35,000 troops led by Brigadier José de Palafox. The Junta of Seville had only one field army, the Army of Andalusia, led by General Francisco Javier Castanos. It consisted of about 15,000 troops, but would be reinforced to nearer 30,000. The Seville junta also controlled most of the Spanish fleet, which was either in Cadiz or Majorca, preparing for Napoleon's proposed Mediterranean invasions. The Seville squadron bombarded and then impounded 4 French warships in early June. The Majorca squadron, meanwhile, stayed put, awaiting orders. Though on paper the Spanish had a sizable army, comparable in size to the French, they were qualitatively inferior. There were too few of Spain's actual regular units to go around. Prior to the invasion, the Spanish infantry had a corps of 34 line regiments, 12 light regiments, and 10 foreign regiments, concentrated mostly in the armies of Galicia, Asturias, and Andalusia. The Spanish cavalry contingent was similarly formidable on paper, but woefully understrength and widely dispersed. Artillery-wise, 34-foot and 6-horse artillery batteries offered hefty firepower, but were never able to be concentrated in any meaningful amount. Militia regiments and volunteer battalions comprised the bulk of Spain's fielded strength. In the initial influx of patriotic uproar, tens of thousands flocked to the Cross of St. Andrew. This was especially the case with the army of Aragon. Palafox's force comprised almost entirely of volunteers. Spain also faced problems with their leadership. Simply put, they were not the best. Pedro Caro Soreda, the Marquis of Romana, was probably their best, and he was up with the Division del Norte in Denmark under French command. Older generals like Blake, Cervellon, and Kesta, who remained behind, never really anticipated much action, if any. The last they'd fought was over a decade ago in the war with France. Castanos and Palafox would prove to be the superior commanders, and they'd been promoted in the years since. Palafox is particularly interesting. After accompanying Fernando to Bayonne, he tried to spring the prince from Valencia, but was rebuffed. Palafox escaped to Aragon, raised his volunteer army, and then, even though brigadier, simply declared himself general in command. Overall, Blake probably had the best claim to seniority, but it mattered little, as all Spanish generals and armies fought isolated from one another. Arrayed against the Spanish were the French corps deployed to Spain. They occupied a wedge of land starting in Navarra, stretching down to Viella Castile, and onto the Spanish heartland around Madrid. In Catalonia to the east, a narrow strip of land was occupied. In total, the French had at least 80,000 troops deployed. At 30,000 strong, 1st Corps under Moncey was the largest. He was stationed in Madrid to protect the king and to match any incursions into Castile. To his north, around Burgos, was Bessieres' reserve corps of about 25,000 troops. South of Madrid was Dupont's corps, 24,000 strong, centred on Toledo. 2nd Corps under Duhem occupied Barcelona and was poised to strike with its 13,000 troops. Strategically, Napoleon occupied the central position, and he deemed it paramount that Madrid and its surrounds be held. Not only did Joseph still need to be installed as king, but to control Madrid was to control the central position from which to strike out at each of the Spanish juntas. However, the protection of Madrid rested solely on a lifeline of resupply and reinforcement, stretching back to Burgos and then Bayonne. This French jugular was dangerously close to 2 operating Spanish armies, the Army of Galicia under Blake and the Army of Asturias under La Cuesta. Worse still, the entire Biscay coastline was exposed to British incursion. With impunity, they could resupply the Spanish, possibly even land troops in Ferrol. What tipped the scales from dangerous to critical was revolt in Santander in late May. As the nearest French force, Bessieres' reserve corps shouldered the burden of pacifying the north and northwest of Spain. Napoleon issued proclamations and pamphlets aimed at assuaging a fearful population, while Bessieres sent officers to negotiate the capitulation of the Spanish cities of Santander, León, and Valladolid. Santander's occupation was pivotal. In late May, a delegation of French officers was arrested, and the city declared for the juntas at the instigation of the Marquis of Santa Cruz and a certain Friar Miranda. Situated almost in the middle of the Bayonne-Burgos road, the threat posed by Santander as a staging ground for Spanish attacks gave Bessieres' mission new import. On June 3rd, Napoleon ordered the Silvery Marshal to occupy Santander, León, and Valladolid, urging him to haste. Quote, "Speed and vigour are essential." From the first step, Bessieres' march was beset by problems. He sent 3 divisions under Merle, Verdier, and Ducos deep into Asturias, passing through the knotty Cantabrian mountains and its corset-tight passes. Each reported that every puebla, every village, spurned the French advance. Either they refused supplies or offered armed resistance. As with all French generals in Spain, Bessieres' standing orders from Napoleon were to treat resistance harshly. Quote, "If we enter a village and find it with weapons in hand, let it be burned. A severe example must be made." These orders were followed to their grim letter. Black smoke plumes marked the French advance. Santander, however, remained out of reach. Merle, Verdier, and Ducos were stuck within just a few days, leaving Bessieres the unenviable task of ordering their withdrawal back to Burgos. When Napoleon was informed of this withdrawal, he questioned Bessieres' judgment. Quote, "The capture of Santander would have nullified the Valladolid uprising. Merle entering Santander on the 8th and then returning to Valladolid, the latter city would have been subdued 2 days later, and from there we would have marched on to Leon and profited from the victory. What I am telling you is for your guidance. Retrograde movements are dangerous in war. They should never be adopted in popular wars. Opinion carries more weight than reality. The awareness of a retrograde movement, which the leaders attribute to whatever they wish, creates new armies for the enemy." Napoleon's tone was not as severe as usual. In other correspondence, he acknowledged that he didn't have accurate maps of the localities in which Merle and Ducos were fighting, and that, quote, "La guerre populaire" was a trying experience. Regardless, Santander still had to be taken. Bessieres recommitted his forces between June 12th and 15th, sending Merle and Ducos back out on the march. This time they stopped for nothing, reaching the gates of Santander within a few days. Having repulsed one attack, the Spanish were not expecting another so soon. The suddenness of the French arrival demoralized the defenders. Santander fell after a performative battle, giving way to French occupation. Bessieres immediately set about seizing the property of junta members, disarming the population, and levying a 2 million franc contribution on the city. Additionally, a delegation of town councillors was sent to Bayonne to accept French dominion. Bessieres could now execute the second phase of the subjugation of the north, the capture of Valladolid and Leon. Merle's division drove on through the Cantabrians toward the twin targets. Having sleepily allowed one city to fall, Blake and La Cuesta were determined to make a stand. Blake protected Leon, La Cuesta Valladolid, only combining their strength when Bessieres' reunited corps approached Medina de Rio Seco, an olive and farming puebla roughly halfway between the two cities. On July 14th, the two forces engaged. La Cuesta and Blake's armies had between them 23,000 infantry and 1,000 horse, supported by 10 cannon. Bessieres had, by now, been reinforced by Antoine Lassalle's cavalry division and by Général Mouton out of Burgos, leading his own division of 2 infantry brigades and a 1,200-strong contingent of the Imperial Guard. Even so, the French were still outnumbered 2-1. What was lacking in numbers was made up for by Bessieres' grit and guile. The two Spanish armies, though in the same area, operated independently. Blake controlled the plateau of Valdasuevas to the southeast of Medina, orienting east to cover the French approach. His forces were arrayed in long lines, 3 deep, with a mixed infantry-cavalry reserve hidden about a half-mile behind the hill. To the north, over a wide plain, stood La Cuesta's army to guard Medina. Bessieres' plan was to pin La Cuesta with his right wing and annihilate Blake with his left. The French arrived early in the morning and arrayed for battle. Artillery was fixed on Monclin, the only slightly raised ground out on the plains. 20 guns blasted away, suppressing the Spanish as skirmishers moved forward to probe the approaches to Valdasuevas. Action opened in earnest mid-morning as the French divisions advanced over the open but potted ground east of Valdasuevas. Without enough firepower to disrupt their formations, Blake could only watch on as the French divisions amassed. Mouton, supported by the Imperial Guard, interposed his division between the Spanish armies. Well covered, Merle and Sabatier unleashed their columns on the attack, driving from the southern and eastern slopes up the heights. Fighting was brutal and bloody, the bayonet preferred for clearing Spanish entrenchments. After an hour, Merle and Sabatier had rolled Blake's regiments down to the edge of the heights, but were not ordered to push too far. The killing blow would be delivered by La Salle, who was unleashed mid-afternoon. Leading his chasseurs à cheval on a sweep to Blake's rear, La Salle successfully routed the Spanish reserve. After that, he plunged into Blake's lines from the rear. Within minutes, the Spanish were ablated between French columns and cavalry charges. From the other side of the wide plain, La Cuesta saw the dust and smoke rise as Blake's army was crushed, leaving behind somewhere between 3,000 and 5,000 dead or wounded. Having been fixated on French demonstrations only in the plains, he'd waited too long to intervene. As Mouton and Merle reformed for a renewed attack on La Cuesta's position, the Galician infantry regiments rolled down the hill in a frontal attack over the plains and up to the Valdasuevas. Pinned in place by tremendous firepower and then attacked in the flank by the Imperial Guard, the Galicians were ripped to pieces, but did succeed in making time for La Cuesta to follow Blake. With the rest of his forces, he retired behind Medina town, suffering only a few additional losses. Bessières was happy to let the Spanish flee. Not only were his troops exhausted, but he was much more interested in the booty left behind in Medina. It was not a particularly costly battle for the French, maybe 400 dead and wounded, but the promise of plunder was too much to turn up. Medina was put to a dreadful sack. Though an opportunity to stomp La Cuesta was squandered, Napoleon was not displeased. Quote, "Mon cousin, I have received at this very moment the message that you sent me on the 14th from Medina de Rio Seco. The battle will be another title in your military reputation. Never before was a battle won in more important circumstances. It has decided the affairs of Spain. I award 100 decorations of the Légion d'honneur to those present at the battle who distinguished themselves most, 50 for the officers, and 50 for the non-commissioned officers and soldiers. Among the latter, you will select at least 10 from the 1808 class, choosing worthy candidates and men who have distinguished themselves." After a subsequent battle against La Cuesta at Benavente, Leon and Valladolid fell, wresting another huge chunk of Spain from Junta control. Asturias and Castile were firmly French, though the Leon Junta managed to relocate to Galicia. We'll now turn back east to Aragon and Catalonia, at the outset of French campaigning there. As we saw, Verdier had not taken part in the second phase of the attack on Santander. The reason was because, on June 15th, he was ordered to attack east to Aragon. After sharing his brigades with Ducos and Merle, Verdier travelled to Soria to take command of a new corps of 2 divisions. The first division was led by Charles Lefebvre Desnouettes, described by Malbaud as, quote, "a brave but imprudent officer." The division consisted of 2 infantry brigades. Second division was led by General Gomes Freire, a Portuguese general in command of the Légion Portugaise, formed out of volunteers from the dismantled Portuguese Royal Army. The attached cavalry brigade was led by Joseph Klopiski, consisting of 1 Polish Lancer regiment and a handful of Spanish volunteers. In reserve were 2 infantry brigades led by Jean-Baptiste Bazincourt. The task of this scratch force was to take Zaragoza. With its central position in the region and control of the Ebro River, whoever had Zaragoza had Aragon. Napoleon attached such importance to this object that he ordered Duhem to support Verdier by pincering Zaragoza from the east. In addition, he was ordered to pacify Catalonia, whilst at the same time protecting Barcelona from counterattack. With his meagre forces, this would be a tall order, and from the starting gun things didn't go well. On June 4th, 4,000 troops advanced on Lerida under Joseph Chabrin, joined by a Franco-Italian cavalry division under General Schwartz. Most of Lecce's division was sent to investigate the situation in the Balearic Islands. In all directions, couriers and scouts were arrested or attacked on the highroads by Catalan insurgents. Their favoured tactic was to draw the French into an ambush in mountain passes, then burn the villages behind them, turning a retreat into a rout. Schwarz's inexperienced troops caught the brunt of it at the Battle of the Brook Pass on June 6th, and had to retreat back to Barcelona within just a few days. Chabrin faced his own ordeal, but eventually reached Tarragona by the 9th, only to receive orders of recall from Duhem who expected the same insurgent forces would soon best his small columns. Leaving behind a small garrison of Swiss troops, Chabrat withdrew back to Barcelona. Duhem needed to salvage something from these dismal failures, so set out again with 4,000 infantry, 2,000 cavalry and 8 guns to reduce the fortress of Girona. The force marched on Mataro, sacking the town after a brief battle, before reaching Girona on June 11th. Against only 350 regular defenders, a mix of Irish regulars and Spanish artillerymen and sailors, Duhem fancied his chance in an assault. What he didn't know was that Girona's small garrison was very well armed and supported by hundreds of partisans roaming the hillsides. What's more, the population of the region, taking refuge in the city, brought with them food and supplies expecting a long siege. Girona's will to resist was rock solid. Unsurprisingly, things went awry immediately for Duhem. The artillery his column brought up was abandoned as one of Lecce's Tuscan regiments was ambushed in the midst of crossing a stream. 2 of these captured guns were then taken into Girona and placed under the command of a Spanish gunnery officer. Duhem sent for a proper siege train of mortars and long guns out of Barcelona. They arrived and were ready for action by June 20th, with the main batteries established in the abandoned towers of Saint Louis and Saint Daniel. 5 days later, reinforcements under Honoré Rel joined the siege camp. In the interim, French engineers had constructed siege works to the best of their abilities, but lacked for tools. Indeed, the story of the siege for the French was basic commodities in short supply, as Spanish partisans interdicted supply convoys out of Barcelona and Figueras. As one of Duhem's aides negotiated with the mayor of Girona, French 12-pounders barraged the front gates while the fortified monastery of San Pedro was assaulted by infantry. Led by a Spanish artillery officer, the captured cannon was wheeled around the flank unseen, delivering devastating fire onto the bundled cords of the French attackers. Though repulsed, Duhem tried again that night. Italian infantry crept into position, managing to scale the walls, only to be repulsed, this time by a countercharge from the Irish troops. Stalemate ensued for the next few days before Duhem pulled up stakes and withdrew back to Barcelona, having taken 700 casualties. Lecce and his 4,000-strong division over in the Balearic Islands fared no better. After disgorging on the coast, his troops immediately took fright at the hostility of the Majorcan people. No promise of plunder or glory could induce them to advance, so Lecce took up a defensive crouch in a series of forts and manors. He intended to await reinforcements from Barcelona, but none would be forthcoming as the Royal Navy ramped up patrols under Thomas Cochrane. Sympathetic uprisings on Majorca ejected the garrisons one by one. Lecce held on with the rump of his force, but was powerless in the face of total demoralization. Rather than be given over to the partisans, he surrendered his division to Cochrane. Back in Aragon, Verdigo too was resisted fiercely at every turn, clashing with the Marquis of Lazan at Tudela on June 8th and Melaine on June 13th, and then Palafox at Aragon on the 14th. By the 16th, Lefebvre Desnouettes was at the gates of Zaragoza with his division. He approached from the west, occupying the fertile fields, olive groves and orchards of the Eras del Rey and the Santa Engracia. Zaragoza itself was ringed by thick and tall walls that would have been intimidating for a medieval army, but stood no chance against modern cannon. The entire northern approach to Zaragoza was inaccessible. One big bridge spanned the Ebro, and it was entirely within the city limits. But trying his luck, Lefebvre Desnouettes ordered an immediate assault. Scaling the walls around the gate of the Portillo, the infantry broke into the western outskirts of Zaragoza, while Polish lancers reeled around south, probing for weak points in its stout walls. For just a single division of 3,000 troops and no heavy artillery, Zaragoza was too tough a nut to crack. It wasn't so much the defences, but the defenders. Garrisoned by 13,000 Spaniards, the French assault was repulsed at the cost of 700 killed and wounded, as well as a few cannons which were abandoned at the gates. Just prior to the attack, Palafox had escaped Zaragoza. He claimed to be off to raise a relief force, though it's clear he despaired at the town's chances of holding out. But good to his word, he returned on June 23rd with a corps of 1,000 regulars supported by 5,000 volunteers. Klopiski was ordered to clear Epila to the west of Zaragoza where Palafox was encamped. Over 2 nights, the Polish lancers, supported by Vistula legionaries and Portuguese skirmishers, routed the much larger Spanish force. The volunteers melted away, though Palafox did successfully re-enter Zaragoza with most of his regulars. The siege of Zaragoza opened on June 26th as Verdier arrived with Frère, Bazincourt, and siege artillery, relieving Lefebvre-Desnouettes. 4 mortars, 12 howitzers, and 30 long guns arced fire into the city from the Monte Terrero. Surrounding convents and the old Moorish fort, the Aljaferia, were also converted into gun positions. On July 2nd, another large-scale assault was launched on the southern walls. Despite the detonation of the Spanish powder magazine and the cover of night, the attack was again repulsed with 500 casualties. After yet another failure, Verdier was wary. He opted now for a conventional siege, bombarding the city into submission, but was unable to ever fully encircle it. He lacked the troops to cover the northern approaches, from which the Spanish freely resupplied and reinforced. After another month of heavy bombardment, Verdier ordered a third assault for August 4th. With the walls crumbling and the streets choked with fallen masonry, the Spanish defenders were pushed from their fortified buildings by a stream of Polish, Italian, and French columns. Verdier's troops seized the south and east of Zaragoza, ejecting their enemy in gory street-to-street duels. Convents and churches witnessed the last stand of Zaragoza's defenders, as many were annihilated to a man. Palafox's surviving regulars were confined to the north and northwest, numbering perhaps a few hundred survivors. It was at this critical stage that Verdier, at the head of a column, sent forward an emissary to the Spanish side, bearing a note stating simply, quote, "Headquarters of Santa Engracia. Surrender?" Palafox responded succinctly, quote, "Guerra al cuchillo. War to the knife." Once again, Palafox was as good as his word. Over the next few hours, the French attack bled momentum, a combination of exhaustion and now instances of looting. Verdier tried to spur his columns onwards to the bridge over the Ebro, only to be wounded by a musket shot and forced to retire. Seeing his chance, Palafox rallied his regulars and rescued several pockets of insurgent defenders. As evening drew near, he had the numbers for a brutal counterattack. The northernmost French column was isolated and almost overrun. Several pockets were formed, the defenders killed without mercy. With nearly 500 dead and 3 times as many wounded or missing, Verdier signalled a retreat to the southern suburbs of Zaragoza. He had neither the manpower nor resolve for another assault, unlike Palafox, who received fresh regular troops from the north, a convoy of ammunition, and the first inklings of Spanish successes in Andalusia and Catalonia. At the head of these reinforcements, Palafox made several successful probing attacks at Verdier's flanks, crossing the Ebro east and west to attack his rear. The walls were closing in for Verdier. On August 8th, he ordered an evacuation, himself departing in the first convoy of sick and wounded. Lefebvre-Desnouettes returned to command, ordered to make the Spanish regret their victory. Firing every last shell at the town, his artillery demolished the remnants of the medieval walls and any buildings behind them. Homes were torched, magazines detonated. Having registered their vain protest, by August 14th, the exhausted French corps was withdrawing to Burgos, having suffered a ghastly 3,000 killed and wounded. It was just in time, as a fresh 16,000-strong Spanish army under Lamas relieved Zaragoza only days later. In clashes with the French rearguard on the road to Tudela, the Polish lancers again distinguished themselves, taking most of Lamas' vanguard prisoner. Overall, the Spanish had suffered about twice as many losses as the French, and Zaragoza was all but razed, but it was a price paid gladly. Palafox had proven to be without question the most sprightly and courageous of any of the Spanish generals, his call for war to the knife setting the tone for the rest of the Iberian campaign. Napoleon, as you'd expect, was quick to downplay the defeat, praising rather than condemning Verdier. He took consolation in the fact that Tudela held out, a position he considered more valuable as it protected the approaches to Pamplona. Zaragoza was not the only Spanish city to hold firm. Further south, Moncey had been ordered to take Valencia, hopefully crushing the junta there. Of the 30,000 French troops in Madrid, Moncey took 10,000 for his expedition. Starting on June 4th, he marched east out of Madrid over rough and dry ground, reaching Cuenca by the 11th. Unburdened by heavy cannon or a long baggage train, progress was good. The only concern was supply. Moncey wanted to travel light, intending to rely mostly on requisitions and foraging for supply, But at every puebla, town or hovel, neither food nor fodder were forthcoming, the inhabitants having deserted their homes. In one puebla, where the French did find food, the high-handedness of the officer inspired a shock uprising. His entire command of 200 was captured and handed over to partisans. Resistance from a small detachment of Cervellon's army was encountered in the mountain passes at Cabrias, and then later at the river at Cabrial, but none failed to arrest Moncey's momentum. By June 26th, he was approaching Valencia. The Spanish were ready. 7,000 of Valencia's defenders occupied earthworks and canals 4 miles west of the city. Over the next few hours, this force was attacked and forced to retreat into Valencia. Expecting that this had sufficiently demoralized the garrison, Moncey ordered an assault, but things went badly. The defenders had flooded the plain so that only the southern wall was exposed to attack. Earthworks and ditches had also been dug along all likely approaches. The first attack was defeated with heavy losses. A second abortive attack, the same story. Moncey was rebuffed with about 1,000 killed and wounded. Here the lack of artillery, so essential to a quick march, bit him badly and no siege was possible. A retreat was called. Napoleon ordered that San Clemente, about halfway back to Madrid, be held at the very least. Acting on these orders, Moncey was harassed by Cervellon's pursuing army. In a series of backhand blows at Játiva and Zúcar, Moncey punished Cervellon's eager but poorly deployed elements. Reinforcing divisions of Frère and Coudenceau out of Madrid stabilized the San Clemente line, but even with these additions, Moncey did not feel confident he could hold, and so continued to withdraw west to Quintana de la Orden, arriving by July 10th, his army mauled but intact. Though Moncey had failed to take his objectives and disobeyed orders from imperial headquarters, Napoleon was forgiving. Writing to Bessières, he chalked the failure up to a lack of ammunition and supplies, and praised Moncey's rearguard engagements. To Anne-Marie Savary, Napoleon confided, quote, "The Valencia affair was never a matter of importance. 20,000 more men wouldn't have made the difference, because by then it was a matter of artillery, not manpower." So in the running tally for the flying columns, it wasn't looking good. Only Bessières, 1 out of 4 so far, had achieved his objectives, and even then only by overcoming great difficulty. The last column would do nothing to rescue French fortunes. The large southern expanse of Spain was without a French presence after the assassination of several Afrancesado governors and mayors. Andalusia had openly declared for Ferdinand and was home to the Seville Junta, the largest and richest of the three, and boasting most of the Spanish regular troops under Castanos's army of Andalusia. The task of suppressing Andalusia was given to Dupont. He commanded a 24,000-strong corps of 4 divisions. First Division was commanded by Gabriel Barbu, consisting of 2 infantry brigades of 2 regiments each. Second Division was commanded by Dominique Vedel, composed of 2 infantry brigades of reservists and a Swiss line regiment. Third Division was commanded by Bernard Georges Frère. Its single brigade was composed of 2 Swiss line regiments and a few battalions of the Imperial Guard Marine. 4th and 5th Divisions were led by Maurice Ignace Fresia and Jacques-Nicolas Gobert, made up of provisional infantry regiments and an Irish legion. The cavalry force was similarly composed of provisional light and medium units, organised into 3 brigades. The artillery division was fairly strong, the 3rd Line Artillery and 6th Horse Artillery regiments, backed by several transport, guard and engineer companies. From day dot, Dupont was plagued by problems. Strained communications and relations with headquarters in Madrid were the culprit. Dupont's main interlocutor was Anne-Marie Savary, sent down to Madrid by Napoleon to kick things into gear. As a sign of his growing trust, Savary had spent less time in Napoleon's direct employ and served instead on independent but crucial duties. For instance, during the Treaty of Tilsit, he'd been the governor of Königsberg, and afterwards sent as an envoy to St. Petersburg pending the arrival of a permanent ambassador. Here in mid-1808, he was to serve as the Commandant Provisoire d'Espagne, the provisional commandant of Spain, after Murat had fallen ill and was unable to carry out his functions. Savary offered an alternate explanation, that Murat was hamming up his illness after affairs in Spain had slipped beyond the limits of his, quote, not over-large mind, as Savary put it. Though ordered to give Dupont all the help he could, Savary delayed releasing Vidal and Gobert's corps and outright refused the use of Frères, who as we saw was sent to aid Moncey. He later claimed this was because he determined, from Dupont's reports, that a major enemy counterattack was inbound, and it was therefore best to withdraw back into La Mancha. In the time it took for Savary to seek instruction from Napoleon, who vetoed the withdrawal and ordered reinforcements sent, Dupont's departure was delayed until June 19th. Confusion and mixed messages abounded. Despite actions to the contrary, Napoleon personally attached little importance to Dupont's success, stating to Savary that it would be, quote, of little consequence if he were to suffer a defeat. Dupont's mission was to seize Cordoba, Seville, and Cadiz in that order, though in truth it would be sufficient simply to hold the mountain passes of the Sierra Morena. For the best possible chance of success, he was to coordinate with Moncey, who was narrowly pulling his army out of Cervellon's trap at Valencia. It speaks to the overconfidence of the French that Moncey was expected to seize Valencia with ease and then plunge into Andalusia from the east alongside Dupont. Under these circumstances, Dupont went it alone. He crossed the Sierra Morena a few days after departing on May 24th, his divisions marching staggered one after the other. They spilled out south and captured the town of Andujar. From this base they ranged west and took Cordoba after blasting through the front gate with cannon, and gutting the few defenders who dared to fire back. The civilian population was likewise given no quarter as undisciplined troops ran rampant. The ancient city was sacked brutally. Gold, jewels, paintings, furnishings, valuables of all and any kind were loaded onto a staggering 500 wagons. Dupont elected to remain in Cordoba for 9 days, claiming it was to reconnoitre the roads to Seville, though in truth he was securing his lion's share of the plunder. An outbreak of disease, probably dysentery, compounded the error. Castanos, at the head of the army of Andalusia, was not idle. He commanded a sizable force of 30,000 Spanish troops, organised into 4 divisions, under Théodore von Reding, a Swiss mercenary commander, Antoine Mallet, the Marquis de Coupigny, an émigré legitimist officer, Félix Jones, a Spanish officer of Irish origin, and finally Manuel de la Peña. Castanos gathered his forces at Seville before departing for Cordoba. Dupont caught wind and, fearing his chances in a stand-up fight, opted to retreat. The sensible option would have been straight north, through the Sierra Morena and back to Toledo. Instead, Dupont went east, back to Andujar. Weighed down by the sick and by the loot, the French advance on the 80-kilometre trip from Cordoba to Andujar was agonizingly slow, taking 3 full days, and exacerbated by the coordinated actions of insurgent units who waylaid isolated columns. From within Andujar, Dupont received one piece of welcome news at least: the arrival of Vidal and his division from Toledo, reinforcements of 11,000 men, bringing Vidal's total numbers up to 24,000. Gobert's 2,000-strong division was not far behind. This was enough of a force to at least challenge for control of Cordoba, but Dupont was still unwilling to risk an engagement. If he didn't escape now, he feared entrapment with no route of escape. On July 9th, in an about-face, Vidal was ordered back north to secure the Sierra Morena passes. Dupont, while awaiting the all-clear, would hold on a 15-mile front along the Guadalquivir River. Entrenchments were dug at Andujar town, with a portion of Vidal's division installed at the ferry crossing at Menguibar, under the command of Louis Liger-Belair. On July 14th, the army of Andalusia arrived in force. Without hesitation, Castanos issued his orders to pierce the river line. Reding's division attacked Menguibar to the east, Coupigny, Villanueva in the centre, and Jones and La Peña head-on at Andujar. For 3 full days, Dupont held firm at Andujar, but Villanueva and Menguibar fell quickly as Liger-Belair and a cavalry brigade from Gobert were almost overrun. Vidal spotted the looming disaster as the central and rightmost Spanish divisions threatened to overrun Dupont's left flank. He raced back through the town of Balién to Andujar on the 17th. For the division-turned corps commander, the situation was critical. One wrong move and his army would be ensnared and destroyed. Dupont's decision was one spawned of this fear. Since he was holding so well at Andujar, Dupont ordered the recently arrived Vidal to turn back, to take his entire division north through Balién regroup at La Carolina, and then forge a path north through to Toledo. Dupont would follow in his wake, conducting a fighting retreat. Plans at the best of times rarely come to fruition, and this was a bad plan made at the worst possible time. Vidal dutifully carried out his orders early on June 17th, passing back through Balién and then onto the mountain passes at La Carolina. Dupont began his withdrawal 14 hours later under cover of darkness. To avoid alerting Castanos, he neglected to destroy the bridge over the river, soon to prove a fatal error. Though Dupont had been informed that by now Vidal was in position, he refused to ditch the bulky loot wagons. So at a snail's pace, the division inched its way northeast into Balién. Having been cleared during the day, Dupont expected to find in the town Gobert's division and any of Vidal's stragglers. What he found instead were Coupigny and Redding's divisions. Gobert's division was already toast, the man himself killed in a foolhardy charge with a small contingent of cuirassiers. His second-in-command, Dufour, escaped with the survivors, but at the cost of leaving Balién wide open to the Spanish. Castanos had interposed himself masterfully into the gap between the French divisions, trapping Dupont between the proverbial rock and a hard place. Night passed with the French outside the town, and Castanos' remaining divisions under Jones and La Peña closing in from the south. Another day passed as the noose tightened on Dupont. Desperate dispatches were sent 30 miles north to Vidal, urging him to once again turn about and race south to the rescue. Until he arrived, Dupont had to try to make some sort of breakout. Before dawn on the 19th, frontal assaults were ordered against the Spanish line to the south and west of Balién. Facing the battered French division were the two intact Spanish divisions, numbering 18,000 men and 16 guns. 5 times the French attacked, and 5 times they were repulsed. Each was a piecemeal attack, first Chabert, then Ponnetier, then Privet and Dupré, before finally the Garde Marine. Fearing that at any moment Castanos might appear to the rear, Dupont sent these attacks into the teeth of Spanish defences without ever concentrating forces for one decisive attack. In the event, it was an unfounded fear. Castanos gingerly advanced with a vanguard and only committed his full force at 2 p.m. Demoralization among the French and Swiss troops, most of whom were conscripts, wrought its own havoc. At one point, Redding managed to induce 2 regiments of Swiss infantry to defect. There was no hope of forcing the Spanish to budge. Dupont realized Vidal was the sole hope of escape. He opened negotiations in the afternoon, sending forward Capitaine Villautre, who secured a ceasefire. With all the guns fallen silent to the west of Balién, the north suddenly erupted. Despite exhaustion from all this marching and countermarching, Vidal's division broke through the Spanish rear, many of their regiments at rest during the ceasefire. A squadron of dragoons under a Colonel Boussard cut their way as far as shouting distance from their entrapped comrades. Had Dupont conserved his strength, he could have cut a path to this lifeline, but all hope soon faded. A Spanish officer, accompanied by one of Dupont's aides, Barbarin, met with Vidal. They bore instructions that Vidal must cease his attack and remain in place for an armistice. The instructions came direct from Dupont, a condition of the ceasefire. Vidal felt honour-bound to comply with the orders to cease the attack, but withdrew back northeast, 1,000 Spanish prisoners in tow. He would make no further attempt to rescue Dupont, who was left to negotiate a surrender for real this time. As per the terms of the armistice, Dupont agreed to surrender the divisions trapped west of Balién on condition that the soldiers were repatriated and the officers paroled. Castanos did not consent. He wanted Dupont's corps, all of it, including Vidal and his bundle of prisoners. The fleeing division had, by the 21st, reached La Carolina at the foothills of the Sierra Morena. Had he wanted to, Vidal could have escaped, but in what can only be chalked up to a misplaced sense of honour, he accepted Dupont's final order: lay down your arms. Vidal's division would share the fate of Dupont's corps. An entire French corps, 18,000 troops and their officers, surrendered as per the terms of the Convention of Balién. For the rank-and-file Fantassins and Sabeurs, it was a worst-case scenario. The Spanish reneged immediately on the promise to repatriate the French soldiers. All 18,000 were taken into custody, stripped of their uniforms, disarmed, and then sent from Cadiz to Majorca, where they were to waste away from disease and malnutrition. It's hard to say how many survived the ordeal, not many, suffice to say. The senior French officers were paroled as promised, and even got to keep their effects unspoilt. You can imagine the reaction when they returned to France, officers without an army. The Spanish let them off scot-free, but the French did not. Napoleon's reaction was, as you would expect, furious, apoplectic, explosive. In every letter he sent, with every word he uttered, he vowed vengeance on the cowards who had shamed France. This included Viautré, an equerry in Napoleon's maison, in addition to being a serving officer, who was fired immediately for supposedly revealing too much to Castanos, as Savary reported to Napoleon. Dupont, of course, was the lightning rod for Napoleon's unreserved wrath, as a letter dripping with venom made out to Minister Clark reveals, quote, "I am sending you these documents about Balién for your own benefit. Read them with a map in hand and you will see if, since the world began, there has been anything so stupid, so inept, so cowardly. This then justifies the Macs, the Hernlers, etc. It is perfectly clear from General Dupont's own account that everything that happened is the result of the most inconceivable ineptitude. He seemed to perform well at the head of a division. He did horribly as a corps commander. When this twist of fate occurred, everything was prospering in Spain. The king, since his arrival in Madrid, was stabilizing every day. Marshal Bessières, after the memorable victory at Medina de Rio Seco, where with 12,000 men he had routed the armies of Galicia and Portugal, and killed 8,000 or 10,000 of them, had driven them out of Valladolid, Palencia, and the Kingdom of Leon. The siege of Zaragoza was progressing rapidly. Everything led us to hope for a different outcome. This loss of 20,000 elite and chosen men, who have now been unavailable without even having caused the enemy any considerable losses, and the moral influence that this must necessarily have on this nation, has led King Joseph to take a major decision by withdrawing to France and shifting his focus to the Aranda and the Duero. I wish to know which courts should try these generals Dupont and Vidal, and what punishments the laws prescribe for such an offence. Dupont and Vidal would indeed be punished. Dupont was court-martialed by a panel consisting of Massena, Augereau, Lannes, Lefebvre, and Serrurier, found guilty of cowardice and dereliction of duty, stripped of rank, of title, and of pension, and imprisoned in the Feu de Joux, the dumping ground for all Napoleon's political prisoners. The other senior officers were immediately returned to service, though they faced social stigma the rest of their careers. Vidal spent a few years in prison. His specific misconduct was the surrender under arms. Had he escaped, a half-course surviving might have at least allowed Napoleon to paint the defeat as something heroic. As it was, the total loss of the corps for zero gain was a PR debacle, unlike anything he'd encountered before. Moray was kicked into overdrive trying to downplay the scale of the disaster. Napoleon wrote worriedly to Champigny, demanding he take precautions to project strength so that the Russians weren't spooked. Ultimately unchallenged, though, was the shocking revelation that the aura of French martial might was permanently tarred. Balién was a horrific scar, a flaring blister on the oozing wound that was the Iberian campaign. As Napoleon remarked, Balién was, quote, a stain on my uniform. For his part, Napoleon did all he could to deflect. In July, he vacated Bayonne for Bordeaux, which is where he was when he learned of the defeat. Savary conveyed the news, received first-hand from a French officer stationed in the Morena passes and escorted north by Spanish hussars, causing a minor scandal. Instead of responding to Joseph's call for him in Madrid, or Moray's calls to return to Paris, Napoleon instead continued with a tour of the French Atlantic coast, Bordeaux to Rochefort, Rochefort to the Vendée to Brittany. News of Balién was suppressed in France, so he could carry on with a pretense that all was going according to design in Spain and Portugal. But all the while, Napoleon was mulling the question of what went wrong in Andalusia. On August 3rd, he wrote to Savary, quote, "The events of General Dupont are unprecedented. They surpass the ridiculous, and the letter of the act is on par with the conduct. After carefully reading General Dupont's account, one sees that he only capitulated the day after the battle, and the generals Gobert and Vidal were not defeated. Everything suggests that General Castanos' army was not as strong as claimed. If Dupont had gathered all his forces at the position of Balién, we estimate him to have had no less than 25,000 line troops. Napoleon's analysis chimes with modern takes. Dupont's situation was not irretrievable until July 18th, when he failed to abandon his baggage and race north. Earlier than this, swift, decisive action against the isolated Spanish division south of the river line would have bought time, possibly even a restorative victory. The composition of the corps is offered as a counterpoint, and the unfair narrative of Balién is one of Swiss and French conscripts crumpling under pressure. I wonder then why the same argument isn't made about the Swiss troops who fought ably for the French in other theatres, and against them too, as indeed was the case at the Battle of Balién, where Reading deployed a Swiss regiment of 1,500 infantry. Conscript troops were not by definition inferior. French conscripts were trained and equipped to a decent standard. In truth, defeated Balién was not the result of a deficiency in the fighting qualities of the poor bloody fantassins, but rather a failure of decisive leadership. At every turn, Dupont was reflexive and slow. Separating his divisions too was a cardinal sin, one advised against except in the most exceptional cases. With Vidal outside of range, Castanos had a layup, scoring a very Napoleonic maneuver victory against a practitioner of Napoleonic warfare. Dupont, by comparison, looked every inch a general of the old school. Napoleon's comparisons to Mack and Hurler were not misplaced. Dull, reactive, and focused on holding fixed positions, this was not the way Napoleon expected his generals to wage war. Dupont, it would seem then, was elevated from divisional command to corps command unduly. But at the same time he was seen as a natural pick. He'd served superbly for a decade as a général de division, proving time and again he was a hard fighter, a solid tactician, and could be relied upon. Dupont's problem was one of poor decision-making, and a dearth of decisiveness when presented with the strategic problems posed by a theatre-level campaign where he was in the driver's seat. But if Dupont is guilty of negligence, of undeniable errors, is not Napoleon also? I don't mean appointing Dupont, I mean his overall strategy in June of 1808. Once Dupont's corps was surrendered, Napoleon was 1 for 6 on his flying columns, counting Lecce. He'd intended for their incisive strikes to cripple the Spanish Juntas in a fell swoop. Instead, Duhem was bottled up at Barcelona, Verdier brutalized at Zaragoza, Lecce stranded in Majorca, Moncey run out of Valencia, his tail between his legs, and Dupont back in France, minus the corps he was entrusted. Only Bessières had any success. So what happened? What went wrong? Strategic priority is certainly a major factor. In a long memorandum written July 13th to Savary, Napoleon had expressed his strategy to subdue Spain and an appraisal of the flying column's progress as it was at the time. Out of all the flying columns, Bessières was the one he placed a premium on because of the threat posed by intervention by the British. Quote, "A blow struck against Marshal Bessières would be a blow struck to the very heart of the army," Napoleon told Savary. "It would cause a kind of tetanus that would be felt at every extreme point of the line." Setbacks in Aragon, Valencia, and Andalusia were tolerable so long as Galicia and Asturias were in French hands. Now that didn't mean the loss of a corps, but it did mean reverses were not unexpected, hence why Moncey, Duhem, and Verdier had been treated leniently. Napoleon was aware that he was asking a lot from a relatively small corps composed of, in the main, second line and reserve units. It's fair then to wonder, did he ask too much? It certainly seems he did, and it was a problem only compounded by an intelligence failure. Napoleon's strategy of the central position was fine, but it required all corps, like wings of a single army, to operate synergistically. For each column, their orders included a general provision to coordinate, for Moncey to join Dupont, for Duhem to join Verdier, and for Bessières to receive reinforcements from Burgos before eventually joining Dupont. These plans were made presuming the relative impotence of Spanish resistance. To be blunt, Napoleon was blithe about the quality of his enemy. He dismissed the Spanish armies as composed of peasants, Spain as a nation led by monks. All evidence to the contrary of coordinated uprisings, of infectious patriotic fervour, of reinvigorated Spanish armies, he dismissed or downplayed. That's why, when Montcy was repulsed, Dupont's operation went ahead unmodified. What resistance could the Spanish truly offer? Likely, Napoleon took the relative ease of his political victory in Spain for a sign of how easy it would be to subdue the kingdom militarily. Had Napoleon taken seriously the effectiveness of the Spanish threat, disaster might have been averted. Further blame lies with the emperor. Though the vastness of Spain and its difficult terrain were accounted for, Napoleon didn't change up the way he conducted his campaigns from afar. Bayonne, while not Paris, was also not Madrid. In every other campaign, Napoleon was in the thick of the action or somewhere close by, and able to direct things quickly. Iberia was a campaign by mail. For a micromanager who rarely let a subordinate operate out of sight, it was a horrific combination of delay and imprecise information. Compounding the issue was Murat's absence. He should have been in command in June and July, but in effect spent most of his time relaying orders from the Grand Quartier Général, the imperial headquarters at Bayonne, to the corps commanders. Even as the point man on the ground, he did not have the leeway to modify strategy. This task fell to Savary as Murat was sick, but Savary too was bound by the need to refer all decisions to Napoleon, undercutting any kind of autonomy implied by the office of Lieutenant d'Espagne, a vice-regal position. They say misery loves company, and Balién was an early sign of the shape of things to come in Iberia. The ferocity of the Spanish people, the harshness of the terrain, long distances, vulnerable supply lines, and overconfident strategy all had combined to create the conditions for one military debacle, to be followed in short order by another. Because July was to prove a very bad month, not just for Dupont, but for his fellow corps commander, Junot. After conquering Portugal, the ambitious general set about its occupation and exploitation. Holding down the entirety of Portugal and its rebellious population with one strung-out corps was a tall order to begin with, before throwing a British spanner into the works. Enter Player 3 into our Iberian intrigues, because straight out of their successful intervention in the Baltic, the British are once again eyeing up the French Empire's exposed flanks. And with their imminent footfall in Portugal, the British are about to radically alter the course of the Iberian campaign, at first jabbing and poking and eventually bursting Napoleon's Spanish ulcer.